is everybody? I don't know if this is if there's anybody else we should be waiting for or anything like this.
This seems to be most of us. We're still missing a few, but I think it's fine if we get started.
Sure. Okay, sounds good. I'm gonna try and share my screen. Okay, cool. Can you guys see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Cool. Sounds good. All right. Well, I'm guessing most of you guys are MS1s. Most or all of you guys are MS1s at this point. If not, I think probably MS2s. Not very likely that there's going to be any MS3s at this point, but it's very possible. But anyways, this sort of presentation that Dr. Rana wanted me to give was pretty applicable to sort of all cases whenever you're doing research, especially with Dr. Rana in this case. All right, so the idea mainly today is sort of how do you take a paper from sort of the initial ideas that you're given or you come up with yourself and then all the way down to sort of getting a paper published and accepted into a journal. All right. So if you have any questions, just sort of, you can either type in chat or you can either save until the end. And then I'll sort of get to those as we go along. All right. So for research, I mean, I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar. I know if you're here, you're probably very likely interested in some type of specialty or something like that that includes a lot of research, and so research is pretty much your first step into academia if that's sort of what you're looking for. You're trying to do academic medicine anytime down the line, whatever the subspecialty or whatever the specialty of medicine you want to do. So obviously it adds to your CV and your resume, having any sort of research and publications or sort of places where you presented your abstracts and your papers and whatnot. That's going to be a huge boost, pretty much irrespective of whatever place you're going into. I think for specific subspecialties or specialties, it might be a little bit different. Some of them don't care about research, but if that's the case, I'm sure you wouldn't be here. And it goes without saying that application-wise and sort of residency interviews, they're definitely going to ask you the most about sort of your research experiences, especially if you have a lot. So being able to sort of do your own project, it really sort of lends itself to a great experience to both talk about and to sort of draw upon if you continue to do research in the future. So basically when you come to do research, now this is a little bit more specific to Dr. Rana's sort of case. There's essentially two aspects of sort of doing research or bringing it to completion. First of all, there's sort of the technical or logistical issues of finishing a research project. Sort of what do you need to do, what's the specific steps, what's the specific protocol and all that and whatnot. So we're going to start with that first, and then we're going to move on to the second part later down the line. So first part is sort of what are the specific steps? Like it's easy and it's nice to sort of talk about doing research and then trying to get it done. And, I'm sure you probably heard from upperclassmen or previous Dr. Rana's students that, he's a great resource and that doing research with him is great. I'm sure he's mentioned Elizabeth's name more than once, Elizabeth Godfrey. She is really amazing. She's done so much research with him that, she has a lot of publications. But obviously hearing that, next question is, well, how do I do it myself? So obviously it is easier said than done, right? People tell you, oh yeah, just go do some research. That's kind of a disingenuous way of encouragement. The bad news is it's hard to come up with good ideas because you need your idea to not only just be something that's worth, something that's like publishable, but at the same time it's something that's also worth being studied. So those can be the same questions and it can be the same sort of impact, but sometimes it's difficult. The good news is you don't really have to come up with ideas. That's not really your part in this too much in the beginning. Good thing is Dr. Rana has a lot of ideas and a lot of project ideas that he's constantly thinking of, and he can also draw from Dr. Goss or anybody else who's sort of in the group who has an idea for that's being studied. And as long as you demonstrate that you're interested, he's definitely going to pass it on to you. And then sort of you'll be able to start off with an idea. Um, so more specifically, how to execute it, depending on whatever project you get, there's always going to be a primary outcome. So this is sort of getting down to the nitty gritties of everything. There's always going to be a primary outcome. For sometimes it might be survival, patient survival, whether a patient is still alive, whether a patient's doing well, whether they're still on a wait list. Um, some other times it could be graft survival, whether that graft is still functioning, whether the patient still needs, patient needs a new transplant or a new graft or something like that. The outcome doesn't even have to be survival factors. It could be just sort of things like prolonged length of stay. So if a patient stays in the hospital 30 days after admission, then we can call that prolonged length of stay, and we can ask, well, what are the reasons why they're staying so long in the hospital? So, and that's where the univariate analysis comes in. You have a whole host of factors and sort of variables that you can look at. And so here is sort of like, it's sort of, there's a lot of different things you can consider. And once again, Dr. Rana is an amazing resource when it comes to this, because you're not really expected to sort of come up with your own list of variables to look at, because honestly, none of us have a really good idea at this point of sort of what can affect the outcomes of a specific project. We don't really know. When I first started my project, I would have never known that sort of, bilirubin, MELD scores and stuff like that would be an important consideration and something to sort of code into your project, when you're considering stuff like, kidney outcomes and stuff like that. So um, Dr. Ron is a great resource to sort of ask and figure out, what's the most comprehensive list of variables that I can study to sort of look at what's going on. And I'm not really going to go over sort of the coding aspect today, since Dr. Rana is sort of, he's the more expert, the better expert on that. But this is sort of the fundamental blueprint of basically every project, right? So once you sort of identified your sort of basket of variables that you're going to play around with, then you put them and you sort of look at them individually, compare them to your outcome. How likely is age over 50 going to result in graft failure after 1 year, something like that, right? Then you come up with a bunch of variables that are significant from the univariate analysis, right? Only when you look at these two variables by themselves, the specific variable versus the primary outcome. And then you put them all together and you do a multivariate analysis where you're not only analyzing these variables by themselves versus the primary outcome, but also amongst each other and against each other. So you're sort of eliminating confounding, eliminating sort of collinearity and stuff like that. Very classic, I'm sure you guys know what confounding is, but there's a very classic example of sort of, alcoholics and lung cancer. There was like, well, alcoholism, people who are alcoholics have a higher chance of getting lung cancer. But when they did a closer study, there was a significant confounding factor of that alcoholics are more likely to be smokers, and obviously smoking is significantly associated with lung cancer. So if you do a multivariate analysis, all of those things will sort of come together, and anything that's not significant or confounding to sort of wash out. So after you've done your multivariate analysis, you'll be able to come up with a bunch of things that sort of, at that point, you can pretty confidently say, wow, these are the factors that independently, affect sort of prolonged length of stay, affect graft outcomes and stuff like that. And then so, and basically at that point, you have the bare bones and the skeleton of a project, of a paper that's already done. You just have to write it up. So once you have the data, once you sort of have the graphs and stuff, and I think all this stuff, depending on how much time you put into it, can either take, as short as potentially a week or a week and a half, along to, however long you want to put it off. But ultimately, this process, you can do it over and over again. I've done it 3 times for my papers. So it's I've done it for three first author papers now. So um, you guys should have no problem doing that. And Elizabeth has done it, more than that, the 10 times more than that, and beyond. So the process itself is not very difficult. Um, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of sort of going on, and I'll be able to answer more questions about this as we go on, if you guys have any more. So, but that's sort of the general gist. If you, as long as you sort of get a hang of this process, you can keep doing it, and there should be no problem. All right, so now here comes the second part, which is a little bit, arguably, in my opinion, more difficult, because it's easy to sort of know how to do something, but the harder part is sort of, do you want to do something, or like, should I be doing something, or how much do you want to be doing something? So motivating at this point is probably the biggest variable, right? So I have no doubts in terms of you guys' motivation. If you're here sort of on a Thursday morning, listening into a Zoom call, I assume, you guys are probably very motivated in terms of getting things done and making sure that you guys are doing the best things for your applications, for your residency and stuff like that. But it is difficult sometimes because the barrier to entry in this case, especially if you don't have a coding background, looking at this stuff the first time is very, very daunting. Like I have a very minimal coding background, but sort of, I've been familiar with coding syntax and stuff like that. Like, how do we define variables, how do we call variables, what are we sort of running. But if you've never seen a computer code before and stuff like that, you don't know sort of the idea and the logic behind some of the computer coding, this can be something that's very, very daunting. And so Dr. Rana is a great resource, and we are all great resources. So if you have any questions, definitely don't feel bad about reaching out to us. I definitely still have people our year who we've taken the static class at the same time, and we always ask each other the same questions too. So it's coding questions all the time. Oh, what does this variable mean? It doesn't even make sense. So definitely feel free to ask us. So that can definitely help with the bigger barrier of entry. But what I commonly hear the most from a lot of people who were in my year and then sort of consequently classes after that is sort of people are like, yeah, I didn't get the time. I don't have the time to sort of delve into this. And personally speaking, I've also been guilty of this. I've definitely used this excuse before, but it's also an excuse that just doesn't really make sense. Everybody has time. You always have time to sort of squeeze out, right? I'm not saying that everybody here is not busy. I understand everybody is busy. Everybody has their own things to do. Everybody has their own list of priorities, right? So when it comes around to sort of doing these projects, if you don't have the time, why were you here in the first place, right? So the thing is, like, when this line comes along and we use this line, it's basically a way to use to sort of give themselves an excuse of postponing and procrastinating, right? So I didn't get to it, saying something like, oh, I didn't get to working on this. That's more fine because you're taking responsibility for sort of not working on a project, right? Not necessarily blaming yourself or not necessarily blaming you. Nobody's ever going to blame you in this case, right? Dr. Rana is very, very accommodating in terms of your time. He understands that, everybody has things to do. However, I feel like a lot of the people who have sort of dropped out from the class at this point, the most common thing I hear is, oh yeah, I have so much things during the day, I didn't get to it. If you wanted to, you definitely could have made the time, right? There's always that thing. If you wanted to make the time for it, you will make the time for it. We make time all the time. We squeeze time out of everything, all the time to sort of fill in Netflix shows, myself guilty as charged here. But, to sort of watch Netflix or do other things and sort of do other things we consider enjoyable or important, right? So if that's the case, as long as you are understanding that you are choosing to not do a project or choosing to not put in time to it, and you're fine with that, that's no problem, right? There's multiple times where I've told Dr. Anna, I'm not really interested in this project, or I didn't get to work on it this week. I just didn't prioritize that. Or if you want to tell him, if you have to tell him that you have an exam, he's also very understanding. That is totally fine. Dr. Rana, I'm not going to be able to do it this week because we have exams coming up in this week and I'm planning to study. Fine. That's okay. Nobody's going to blame you for that. All right. So biggest thing, just sort of take responsibility of how you spend your own time. All right. So like I said earlier, bad news is sort of this type of sort of research is going to be extremely difficult for you to just figure out by yourself without a good mentor. The coding aspect, the sort of figuring out variable aspects and all that stuff is pretty meticulous and very tedious. Kind of dry unless you're sort of get into a rhythm and sort of really into that kind of stuff. The good news is Dr. Rana is probably one of the best mentors I've seen, or in my short course of in my short medical school career, I guess. Um, he's pretty much almost always available, which is and I'm sure some of you guys have tried emailing other doctors, other attendings, and trying to get research projects and whatever, but you know people in my year, and I myself too, have sort of this experience where other doctors, you email them for research and they either ghost you or they eventually get back to you 2.5 weeks later. They're like, yeah, sorry, I'm not really doing research. And you're just like, well, how come you have research topics on your profile page and stuff? So but Dr. Rana is pretty much the antithesis of this, in that he basically will always be available to you depending on sort of what you need from him, and he's always a good resource. um, Obviously he's busy, but he'll definitely try and make time for you, so you won't ever feel neglected in terms of when you're working on your own project, right? So, and I think that's probably the biggest thing, is frustrations from projects definitely come when you have no idea what you're doing and the person who's supposed to be helping you on it is not responding to your messages and stuff, so or your emails. So Dr. Rana is, you guys are very blessed in that case, in that Dr. Rana is very, very helpful, very, very open, and very, very available, which is not the case for most attendings who are doing research. um, so I think you can definitely email him. It depends on if he's giving you guys his personal number. You can also text him as well. Honestly, I've always prided myself as somebody who replies to text relatively quickly, but he replies within a minute. So it's definitely very, very helpful if you have a sort of small question that you don't think is necessary to sort of send in an email or something. If you just want to ask him something like that, he's always available. Just mind when you send it, right? Obviously, don't send it to him at 4 a.m. in the morning. Be respectful of his time as well. Um, so last thing, probably good or bad news. This sort of publication speed and the research that you get to do with Dr. on this sort of large database research, it's really as fast or as slow as you would take it. So I think probably the leading example would be Elizabeth. I think Dr. Rana probably mentioned her a lot, and I think you guys will be getting a lecture from her as well. So she has probably, uh, I'm not sure the exact number, but definitely double digits in terms of the publications that she's gotten out of her work with Dr. Rana. So, if you're motivated and you spend your time wisely, you can definitely get to that level. Not necessary that you need to get to that level to be a competitive applicant, um, with respect to research, but definitely possible, right? And so I myself, I have 3 first author papers that have gone through. One of them has been accepted to JAMA surgery, which Dr. Rana has said is a pretty good journal. And then that one has gone through sort of a couple rounds of revision itself. So since the inception is probably around, I would say late 2019, probably around October or November or something. So over this course, it's probably like 6 or 7 months. So almost, a little bit more than half a year, to sort of get it from, the first idea of saying, what do we want to do with this outcome, all the way down to now it being accepted. So the process is usually kind of long, but like I was definitely finished with the project by around December. So you can probably finish it within a couple of months, and then the publication speed by the journals is not really within your control, because the journals take their time in terms of reviewing and sort of revising and whatnot. So you have to include and accommodate for a lot of that stuff. So you guys getting started now and doing projects now, this is a great time, so because you guys are finishing up your first year. You guys have a little bit in your second year in the beginning to sort of do preclinical and lecture stuff. So there's a lot more time you can sort of focus and sort of get one paper down, get a lot of publications and get a lot of abstract and sort of presentations out of those papers that you do as well. And that way you can sort of get yourself prepared so that when clinics come around, you're not constantly worried about how many research projects that you have, how many publications, publications lines, so at that point during clinics you can definitely feel good about focusing on clinicals. So yeah, and then so high yield points, don't make excuses for yourself or to yourself. This is probably one of the main ways I've seen people sort of stumble and sort of drop out and eventually just lose interest. Like obviously if you're not interested, if you don't think this type of research is for yourself, nobody's blaming you, right? If you don't want to do it, say no, right? But don't accept a project and then drag on it for 6 months and then come back and be like, yeah, I didn't know what to do. And then you're just like, well, it's been 6 months. This project could have been given to somebody else who would be able to do it or is willing to put in the work to figure out how to do it. So if you don't like it, if you don't want to do the project, say no. Nobody's going to be blaming you for it. Nobody's going to be holding it against you. And Dr. Rana, obviously, like I said before, he's a great resource, very willing to work and accommodate with you. So he's almost always available. And he'll tell you if he's not available, if you just try and texting him, if you try emailing him and stuff like that. So research itself, especially with Dr. Rana, has a very high ceiling and very low floor, right? So what I mean by that is, you put in as much work as you want and you can get, the most out of it. You can get so much out of it, you can do, if you're motivated, you're doing a lot of good stuff, put in the time, then you can get upwards of sort of double digit publications in the case of Elizabeth. And or like if you're sort of you don't have to shoot that high to sort of still feel pretty comfortable, you can sort of pace yourself along as well, and then get to the point where you're not really worried about research as you're entering clinicals, right? So you hear a lot of the stories about MS3s who are doing research after clinicals, frantically trying to find research projects and stuff, so what's a good way to think about it is at that point, you don't want to be the person who's willing to jump on any project. You can be the person who's sort of handing out research projects, right? You can be like, hey, say I have a project. You want to work on this with me? You can take a second, you can help me write it up, and I have all the analysis done and whatever the case. And then at that point, you can sort of, you're helping out one of your classmates and at the same time you're getting another pub out of it. So low floor, obviously, if you don't do anything. If you sort of keep making excuses for yourself, you're not going to get anything done. So lastly, all of the previous classmates that I had or previous stata class people, they're all great resources. Definitely reach out. I think if you have questions about who to reach out to, you can definitely reach out to myself. My contact information is going to be on the next slide, but also you can ask Dr. Rana whenever he wants or whenever whoever he has in mind for you to reach out to. So that being said, there's my email. Definitely feel free to email me. And if anybody has any questions, definitely chime in here.
Hey, Teddy. It's Jay Garza.
Hey.
So a couple of questions I had were, so you were talking about, and I know Dr. Rana has touched on it, but like this type of research, especially with stata, you can have a start and stop period. And how do you, like, what's the best way to do that? so that you don't have to, you know, once you start a project, you don't have to finish it all the way through. You know, you can wait a couple weeks if school comes up or whatever. What's your way of starting and then
Mhm.
or stopping and then starting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think so. My usual, and that sort of really depends on personal preference. So it's sort of how you partition which stages of a project depends on sort of how much you feel like you can get through in one time. So when I first started my first project, it was sort of based on a code that Dr. Rana gave me, and sort of it was sort of reading through and figuring out what the code meant, and then running the code, and then seeing sort of what variables come out. So in the beginning, it was really slow, right? The first two lines, I was like, okay, what the hell is all this? And putting Google next to the next screen, you know, with the code and sort of figuring out what each line meant, and sort of that was pretty tedious. But as I went along, sort of understand what the code was trying to do and sort of the bigger, you know, bigger ideas, it was sort of more, I just couldn't help myself and sort of just kept going. But obviously, that's not always the case, and I think the biggest thing to sort of remind yourself is open communication with Dr. Rana is always the best. So if you ever things come up, you know, and I understand things definitely will come up, you know, exams, definitely your school and everything, grades and stuff like that. Um, those definitely come first, right? So, you know, rotations, grades, and anything that's graded, sort of things like that, those all come first. And you know, if there's a conflict between those two things, definitely take, you know, grades, and you know, your school takes precedence over research because everything here is sort of extracurricular. And you know, however much you get through, that's fine, as long as you're clear in your communication with Dr. Rana in terms of what's going on, right? If you tell him, you're like, hey, um, I have an exam next week and stuff like that. You can do as little as or as much as you want. You can partition it based on number of lines of code. You can say, okay, I can get through like 10 lines today, right? Or something like that. Figure out what that means. Or you can do it based on chunks of sort of what the code means. You know, it's like, okay, well, I want to run the univariate analysis today, or I want to run the multivariate analysis today, or I want to generate 2 or 3 graphs, right? And honestly, I think the hardest part in the beginning is sort of looking at the code and you're like, what the hell is all this? But once you sort of understand the code and sort of where it comes from, a lot of times you're never going to have to sort of generate that entire code file by scratch. Which is one of the great things that, you know, working with Dr. Rana is that he sort of gives you a lot of code that you can sort of piece together. So you're never really at one point writing an entire code document. So that's always a good thing. So whenever you're sort of doing analysis, you can do it in sort of pieces. You know, I want to see what this variable does. I want to see what this variable does, and sort of piece that out. And definitely that's the case when you're writing a paper too, writing the manuscript. You know, you can say, well, I want to finish the method section. I then want to do the result section today. And sort of you can definitely, you know, piece it out stepwise like that. And I think communicating with Dr. Ron in that case is the best. You know, like the more you tell him what you're doing, the more FaceTime and the more transparency, the more he's going to sort of appreciate that and like you and sort of, you know, lean on you, right? So I think one of the reasons why Dr. Ron asked me to give this talk to you guys is also because I was sort of the person who came in the most, you know. Yeah, I had the most questions and sort of came into his office all the time and his clinic to sort of see him like, you know, oh, Dr. Arnold, what does this line mean? You know, even if it's sort of a relatively innocent question, you know, what does this line mean and stuff like that. So as long as I think you communicate with him and you tell him sort of everything that you're dealing with, I think, you know, it should be no problem. Hopefully that answers your question.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions?
I can ask one more. So I think I heard that you're heading into orthopedics, and I'm wondering how you're going to adapt this research knowledge over to any sort of orthopedic research.
Yes, that is a great question. So one of the things you'll learn about orthopedics is that I don't really think for the most part, they don't really care about the research topics that you're doing. So a lot of times it's sort of very, very much a numbers game in terms of how many publications do you actually have, right? Now, granted, you do want some ortho research, on there, and I think that is a little bit more difficult to sort of find compared to, just somebody as great as Dr. Rana in terms of being a research resource. But for the most part, I think it is mostly a numbers game in terms of how many pubs do you have on there. And I think ultimately you should, by the end of, when you're applying, you should eventually get onto one ortho project. And I think that I think is mainly related to sort of, if you ask and reach out to BOSS, which is the ortho interest group, they definitely have some good resources to sort of connect you with people who are doing research in terms of orthopedics. But to be fair, Baylor Orthopedics is a little bit, scarce in terms of the research presence. But I would say don't worry about it too much if a lot of what you have in the beginning is sort of, this type of research, because you just want to fill it up at first, right? It's all a numbers game.
Yeah.
Whatever you go into, you want to fill it up first. So that is a good concern. But I would say at this point, unless sort of you already have like, 3 or 4 pubs that are sort of stacked underneath your belt, that are not orthopedics, then you can perhaps think about sort of diversifying and stuff like that. So, but good question.
Definitely. Thank you.
All righty. I guess any last minute questions from anybody? If not, definitely feel free to email me. My email is just my name, so Theodore, Theodore .Zhang. Let me see if I can type it in chat. That way you guys aren't just listening to me trying to talk. So yeah, so definitely feel free to email me. And I presumably Dr. Ron is gonna refer you to some of us as your projects sort of go on. If you guys have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out. I understand in the beginning it can be a little bit stressful, a little bit difficult, but try your best. Sort of. I know that you guys are all very devoted and very driven people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, on a Thursday morning listening to me talk. But so just if you have any questions, definitely feel free to email me, reach out, or ask Dr. Rana, who is a good resource for a particular project, because I know some people in my class, they've done other types of projects that he knows about, so he might refer you to other people as well. So but yeah, so other than that, if you guys don't have any last minute questions, hopefully this helped, and I know you guys have been recording it, so hopefully it helped. Always feel free to refer back to it, and definitely reach out if you have any more sort of personal questions or specific questions that you wanted to ask one-on-one. And hope everybody has a wonderful Thursday afternoon.
Thanks so much, Teddy.
You're
Thanks, Teddy.
Of course. Yeah. Have a great afternoon. All right.
You too.